Kansas in the summer of 1884 was the kind of dry that gets personal. The grassland ran flat and gold from horizon to horizon, the color of a thing past the point of recovery, and the sun sat overhead from 8 in the morning until 6 at night and gave no quarter to anything that wasn't stone or iron. Crops failed. Cattle stood at dried creek beds and bawled. People who had come to the prairie full of plans found their plans going yellow at the edges, same as the grass. It was into this afternoon that Lydia Finch appeared at the edge of Caleb Mercer's land. She had been walking for 5 hours. You could tell by the state of her shoes and the set of her shoulders, which had given up the upright posture of someone who still believed the destination was close, and settled into the forward lean of someone who has stopped caring about the distance and is simply enduring. She carried a canvas bag, and she was not asking for anything, which was the first thing Caleb noticed when he came out from the barn and saw her at the gate. She stopped when she saw him. "I'm not trespassing," she said. "I'm just at your fence. I can keep on the road." He looked at the road, which was a dirt track baked to dust and running through nothing but more of the same, for as far as either of them could see. "You're heading somewhere?" he said. "I was heading to Wheat Hollow to take a position. The wagon I was in left me outside of Grassfield 3 days ago, and the driver said—" She paused. "It doesn't matter what he said. Can I work for my supper? Whatever needs doing." He looked at her hands. They were not soft hands. He looked at her boots, worn straight through at the side of the right heel, the kind of wear that takes months of daily walking. He looked at the wheat field behind him, gold and close to ripe, heavy with the weight of the only good thing the season had produced. "Come in off the road," he said. "There's water by the well." Her name was Lydia Finch, and she told him that with the flat directness of someone who has stopped expecting the name to mean anything to a new person and is simply offering information. She did not say her father's name. He did not ask. She drank water and worked. She did not ask what needed doing. She looked at the kitchen and saw what needed doing and did it. She found the split in the floor by the door and plugged it with a rag from her own bag. She mended 2 rips in the feed sacks in the corner. She found the pan with the stuck handle and fixed it with a nail and a flat stone. His daughter, Annie, 8 years old, watched all of this from the kitchen doorway with the caution of a child who has learned that the appearance of helpfulness is not always the same as helpfulness. But when Lydia, without looking up from the mending, said, "Do you want to hand me that thread?" Annie came into the kitchen. At supper, beans and cornbread and weak coffee. Lydia ate without embarrassing herself by eating too little or too much, which Caleb thought was a skill more people should have. Annie ate and watched Lydia. Caleb ate and thought about the wheat field and the mortgage payment due in September. After supper, Lydia said, "I'll sleep in the barn if that's all right." "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. She hesitated. He could see her calculating the complications. "I'm not offering anything else," he said, flatly. "It's a room with a door." "I understand that," she said. "I'll take it." She was up before dawn. He heard the stove being lit, and the smell of coffee reached him before he'd finished pulling on his boots. And when he came into the kitchen, she handed him a cup without ceremony, and he drank it, and they didn't need to speak about it. He went out to the field. She stayed in the house and made the day run like a day was supposed to run, which it had not for a long time. 2 days, that had been the arrangement. Work for supper, 1 night in the room, morning coffee, and then the road. But the second morning came and went, and neither of them quite arrived at the conversation that would end it. She had found the rip in the barn's loft floor and repaired it before he knew it needed doing. She had seen the gap in the smokehouse wall where the wind came through and plugged it with clay mixed with old ash, which held better than most. She had taught Annie to identify the difference between the locust grass and the pasture grass at a glance. The locust grass was shorter and more tightly rooted and had a particular dry smell in the afternoon heat, and Annie had absorbed this with the concentrated attention she gave to useful information. Caleb was not a man who said more than he needed to say, but he was observant, and what he observed was that his house ran better with Lydia Finch in it than it had in the 2 years since Emma died, and that Annie ate her supper with something closer to appetite than he'd seen in those 2 years, and that the sound of a second adult moving around the morning kitchen had stopped feeling like an intrusion and started feeling like something else. He did not examine this closely. He was a practical man. He simply let the third morning come and went out to the field without saying anything about it, and she lit the stove and made the coffee, and that was that. At supper on the third night, Annie asked Lydia why she hadn't kept going to Wheat Hollow. Lydia looked at her plate. "There's work here," she said. "You could have gone when the locusts left," Annie said, not unkindly, just practically. Annie was a practical child. "I could have," Lydia said, "but you stayed. I stayed." Annie considered this. She ate a bite of cornbread. Then she said, "Do you know anyone in Wheat Hollow?" "No." "Is there anyone in Wheat Hollow who needs you?" Lydia looked at the girl. "I don't know." "Then staying here makes sense," Annie said, as if it were simple arithmetic, and went back to her supper. Caleb did not look at Lydia. He looked at his coffee cup, but his shoulders, which had been carrying a particular brace for 2 years, settled a small but noticeable degree. At mid-morning she came to find him in the field because she had seen the sky, and the sky was doing something she recognized. "Do you have all the horses in?" she said. "The horses are in the—" "Get them in the barn and close the doors," she said. "I need your washline cloths and a bucket, and I need to know where your trough and ash piles are." He looked at the sky. It was not a storm sky. It was clear and dry and terrible. "What's coming?" he said. "Locusts," she said. "Listen." He listened. There was a sound under the wind that he had not identified, that he had taken for the wind itself, or perhaps his own imagination, but which resolved, now that he was paying attention, into something more like the sound of paper against paper, or water in very fine streams, multiplied to the edge of noise. "How long?" he said. "The edge of the cloud is close. Maybe an hour, maybe less." "How do you know what that is?" She looked at him. "My father taught me." She didn't say anything else about her father. "Do you want to save the wheat or not?" He went for the horses. What followed was the hardest 3 hours of work Caleb had done since his wife's funeral, and it was organized entirely by a woman he had known for one evening. Lydia directed it with the focused brevity of someone who had done this before. She knew where to dig the shallow diversion trenches, not to stop the swarm, but to channel where they settled. She knew which sections to sacrifice and which to defend. She knew to use smoke from the damp clovers cut from the low corner of the field, not dry grass, because dry grass would take the wheat. Annie worked beside her, without being asked and without being praised for it, which Lydia seemed to understand was the right way to work with Annie. Caleb worked the western edge of the field, which was the worst of it, the part where the swarm came down thickest. He followed Lydia's instructions because he had nothing better, and because in the first hour they had clearly been right. When the swarm passed, or mostly passed, and the sun came back in and they could see the damage, the field had lost perhaps a third. Not a good result, but not a ruin. Half a mortgage payment still standing, where without her there would have been nothing. He stood at the edge of the field and looked at what was left and did not speak for a long time. Lydia sat down in the dirt at the edge of the first row and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just the full-body exhale of someone who has spent 3 hours running very hard and now has to stop. He walked over and crouched down beside her and said, "You did more than a supper's worth." She looked up. Her face was dark with smoke and field dust. "I need to stay 2 more days," she said, "to retrench the south ditch." "You can stay. I'll work. I can see that," he said. In the town of Wheat Hollow on the following Saturday, Silas Crow kept a general provisions and grain buying operation that had grown during the drought years into something larger and more complicated than it appeared. He also kept a good memory for names and a particular alertness to the families whose crops were failing. He was standing outside his store when Caleb brought Lydia into town for supplies, and he put his pleasant voice on and his city leather boots and came over to make conversation. "Mercer," he said. He looked at Lydia. "And this would be?" "Lydia Finch," she said. Something moved across his face. "Very small, very fast." "Ezra Finch's girl," he said. "That's right." His pleasant voice did not change. "Terrible thing, your father's accident." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it was." She turned away first, which was the correct move, and Caleb followed her into the dry goods store. And inside she picked up what they needed with steady hands and didn't say anything until they were loading the wagon. Then she said quietly, "Crow was there, before the fire. I didn't know it before this moment. I've only seen him once, and it was brief, but I know how he moves." Caleb put down the sack of flour. "Before the co-fire," he said, "the night before, at the edge of the building." He said nothing. He thought about the way Crow had looked at her name. He said, "Your father was blamed for that fire." He was. He was using a locust repellent that season, my method, what I showed you, and they said he'd been careless with it near the hay stores. But the fire started on the east side of the Co., not the west. My father's work was all on the west side. She put the last bundle in the wagon and climbed up without waiting for help. "The fire started on the east side," Caleb said, "where the damp bales were kept. Damp bales don't catch from a spark. They catch when something dry is placed against them." She looked straight ahead at the road. "My father told me that afterwards. He knew. He just couldn't prove it." Caleb climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. He said, "There's a box in my barn my wife kept. Letters. She was a careful woman. She kept records of every business dealing. If Crow was involved in the sale of the grain from that fire, she would have recorded the prices." Lydia looked at him. "Let me look," she said. That evening, in the barn with a lamp and the two of them sitting on upturned crates, they opened the box. It was full of his wife's handwriting in her small, precise letters, and it was hard to look at, but he looked at it because that was what the box required. 3 transactions with Crow's company at below-market grain prices, dated in the month after the Finch fire. 1 transaction 4 months before the fire for an unusual quantity of dry baling materials delivered to Crow's address. An inventory from a neighbor rancher who had bought grain from Crow that same autumn that noted the quality as water-stained and smoky, as if stored near a heat source. Not a conviction, but a path toward one. Caleb closed the box. He said, "My wife kept everything." Lydia looked at the box and then at him. She said, "What was her name?" "Emma. She was careful. She was the most careful person I've ever met." He set the lamp on a post. "She would have liked that you knew about the locusts." Lydia looked at her hands in the lamplight. "My father would have liked her records." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the barn, with the sound of horses and the summer insects outside, and the weight of all the careful people who didn't make it through to see the things they'd tried to protect. He said, "We need Mrs. Bell at the general store. She keeps records too. And there's a man named Harlan at the county seat who does investigations for the land office. He's honest, which is rarer than it should be." "We'd need the co-records from the insurance claim," Lydia said. "The origin of the fire in the official report. Can you get those? I know someone who was on the investigation. He owed my father a debt. He might." Caleb stood up. He held the lamp. He said, "Stay until it's done." She looked at him. "Not for the field," he said, "because this is worth doing and you're the only person who knows what your father knew." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mortgage is in September." "It is. We should trench the south ditch before we do anything else." "In the morning," he said. She stood up. "In the morning." The harvest came in at 60% of a good year, which was not what he'd hoped for, but was enough. Enough for the mortgage. Enough, barely, to carry through winter if the feed prices held. Annie helped with the binding, and she did not stop to be praised for it, which was still Annie. But at the end of the harvest day, she walked back to the house beside Lydia instead of beside her father. And she was talking, actually talking, the way she hadn't talked since her mother died, about the way the wheat moved in the wind before it was cut, and what that sounded like, and whether it had a name. Lydia said it did. She said her father had called it the field saying goodbye to itself. Annie thought about this. Then she said, "That's sad." "A little," Lydia said, "but it's also just what happens. The sad thing and the natural thing are sometimes the same." Caleb walked behind them and listened. Silas Crow was presented with the inventory records, the delivery records, the insurance investigation, and the testimony of Lydia's father's neighbor, who remembered the quality of the grain and who remembered that the east baling area had been unusually tidy after the fire, as if the remains of something had been cleared away, at a formal hearing before the county land officer and a representative of the Grain and Commodity Exchange in late September. Crow's representative tried twice to introduce Lydia's father's history as evidence of negligence. The land officer said the relevant question was where the fire had started, not what Ezra Finch's methods were. Mrs. Bell confirmed the supply records. The county investigator confirmed the origin discrepancy in the official report. Crow said his attorney said somewhat more, but the words had no foundation under them. Harlan signed the finding. The insurance reimbursement claim filed by Crow's company was referred to the state insurance regulator. The grain exchange suspended his trading license pending further investigation. Deputy Harlan Pike, who had been present at the hearing and who had 2 outstanding complaints against him for pressure on homesteader families during the drought years, was suspended pending a separate review. Lydia stood in the afternoon light outside the county building and felt the autumn on her face and thought about her father, who had been a careful man and a good one, and had known what was worth knowing, and had not been believed in time. He was believed now. She did not know what to do with that except feel it. Caleb came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He was good at not saying anything in a way that wasn't empty. She said, "He used to say that the truth about land is always underground. You just have to know where to look." He said, "Sounds like Emma." She looked at him. Were they similar? "Careful people often are," he said. They walked back to the wagon together. Annie was already in the back, reading one of the 2 books she possessed, held very close to her face in the failing afternoon light. She looked up when they climbed in. She said, "Are we going home?" Caleb looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Annie, at the book, at the word home said, with the confidence of a girl who knew where home was. "Yes," Lydia said. "The spring planting that year, they mixed new seed with the last of the grain store from the previous harvest." Lydia had brought a tin of her own seeds, a variety her father had developed for the Kansas grassland, drought-tolerant and close-rooted, the kind of grain that bends in the wind instead of breaking. She tipped the tin into the seed bag alongside the Mercer stock and worked it through with her hands. "That's your father's line," Caleb said. "Half of it. The other half is yours." Shot tied off the bag. "Some things grow better together." Annie nodded as though this were simply obvious, which, to Annie, it probably was. The field came in strong that summer, not because the weather was good, the weather was indifferent as usual, but because the rootstock held through the dry weeks, and the locust trench ran true around the east quarter. And there were 2 people and 1 practical child working the land instead of 1 man with too much to carry alone. On the Dakota Prairie, the things we plant are never only what they seem. A grain that bends is teaching something. A seed kept through a father's disgrace is saying something about what outlasts judgment. And on the morning you mix someone else's hope with your own and put it in the same ground and watch it grow. That is the morning you find out what your hands were always meant to build. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.